Do you believe a father's greatest fear is watching his child make a mistake? I used to think so, but I was there, sitting at the table, and I discovered something far more painful. A father's greatest fear is realizing that, to his own family, he no longer matters. They told me, "Don't offer any more opinions." And my response shocked them all. Imagine your legacy, the memories of a lifetime, becoming an unbearable burden for those you love most. That's how I felt. In an instant, a sincere piece of advice became the trigger for my own exclusion. Today, I'm going to show you the story of Don Eduardo, an 80-year-old architect in Argentina who, with a single phrase, watched his world collapse. You'll then discover what happens when silence becomes your only way out, and how he used his greatest weakness to start a new life. Every second counts, because Don Eduardo's lesson is a mirror for all of us. To what extent do we ignore the wisdom of those who have lived longer than we have? Stay with me until the end, because you won't believe the radical decision he made the next day to prove the worth of his voice, and what his family found in place of the home filled with memories. I was 80 years old when I finally realized I had become invisible in my own family. My name is Eduardo Romero, though most people used to call me Don Eduardo, more out of habit than respect lately. I live, or used to live, in the Palermo neighborhood of Buenos Aires, in the same house I built with my own hands 50 years ago. Every arch, every window, every wooden joint carries something of me. I was an architect, not famous, but proud of what I created. After my wife Teresa passed away, that house became more than just home. It was a museum of our life together, a place held together by memories, dust, and stubbornness. My children, Marcos and Sofia, would come with their families every Sunday for almuerzo. It was a tradition I clung to like a shipwrecked sailor to driftwood. I'd start cooking early, wearing that ridiculous apron Teresa bought me back in the 80s, yellow with the words El Rey de la Cocina. It had a burn mark from that one Christmas I tried to flambe dessert and nearly set the curtains on fire. The house would fill with the scent of meat roasting and garlic frying, and for a few hours it almost felt like the past was still alive. But traditions grow heavy when love turns into obligation. Lately, the meals felt rushed. They'd come in, kiss me on the cheek out, of duty, sit around the table, scrolling on their phones or bickering about schedules. I noticed that no one asked how I was anymore. They talked around me, above me, never to me. I became a piece of antique furniture in my own dining room, there but unnoticed. That Sunday started like the others. I had made empanadas de carne picante for the appetizer and a bife de chorizo with papas al horno for the main course. I even opened one of the last bottles of Malbec Teresa had picked out before she got sick. The kids laughed politely and the adults gave me mechanical smiles, but I could feel the difference. It was like serving a feast to ghosts. Nobody really tasted anything. After lunch, we gathered in the living room, as we always did. My grandson, Tomas, barely 22, started talking about his new crypto startup with that usual millennial confidence that mixes ignorance with arrogance. He was speaking of burn rates and rounds of funding, but I could hear the panic behind the buzzwords. I recognized that tone. I'd heard it from clients on the brink of losing everything. I waited until he finished, then gently offered my thoughts. I told him about a housing project I'd once overseen that nearly bankrupted me because I didn't diversify my resources. I spoke calmly, as a man who's made mistakes and lived long enough to learn from them. But before I could even finish my thought, Marcos raised his hand. Not like a son, but like a traffic cop. "Father, please," he said, in that sharp, dismissive tone he uses when talking to interns. "Don't offer any more opinions. We know what we're doing." The room fell silent. Even the baby stopped babbling. Sophia looked away. Tomas fidgeted with his phone. No one defended me, not even with a glance. I just nodded, excused myself to the kitchen, and began cleaning plates that weren't really dirty. It's strange how you can hear your own heart breaking when the rest of the world goes quiet. I stood in the kitchen with the faucet running, pretending to scrub a plate that only had a few crumbs. The water hit the porcelain with a sharp hiss, but I couldn't feel my hands. My ears were burning, not from anger, but from shame. That kind of shame that doesn't scream. It settles in your chest like a slow fog. I looked at the sink, at the familiar tile Teresa had chosen, and I realized I didn't belong here anymore. I was just a ghost in a house full of people still breathing. I heard them laughing again in the living room, not in a joyful way, but the awkward, forced chuckles of people trying to move on quickly from something uncomfortable. Marcos was probably cracking one of his dry jokes, and Tomas had resumed his monologue. I stood there, back turned to them, letting the sound muffle against the steam of the water. No one came to check on me. No one noticed I had been gone from the conversation for over 15 minutes. I dried my hands slowly, carefully folding the towel the way Teresa used to, and walked out, without making eye contact. I sat at the edge of the hallway, by the small credenza where I kept our photo albums. I opened one at random. A picture from 1989, Marcos with his first bicycle, me holding the handlebars, and Teresa laughing barefoot on the grass. We were happy once, not perfect, but happy. That moment looked like a painting now, still, silent, untouchable. I heard them getting up, gathering their things. I closed the album and placed it gently back where it belonged. Marcos shouted, "Thanks for lunch, Dad." As if nothing had happened, they all waved from the door. Even Tomas gave me a thumbs up like a child leaving school. I forced a smile and waved back, then watched the gate close behind them. The street went quiet. The silence after their departure was louder than any insult they could have spoken. That evening, I sat in the armchair by the window, the one with the sun-bleached arms and the loose spring. I watched the light shift on the floor as the sun went down, drawing long shadows across the tiles. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat, breathing slowly, holding my old tobacco pipe in one hand. I hadn't smoked in years. I didn't even light it. I just held it, like an artifact from another life. It hit me then, not in a flash, but like a slow turning of gears, that I had been waiting for something to change, for someone to see me again. But no one was coming to rescue me from this role I didn't choose, the aging man whose only value was silence. And once I knew that, I couldn't unknow it. I felt something shift in my chest, not pain, not rage, something colder, final. I stood up, walked to the study, and pulled out the thick leather folder where I kept all the property documents, bank records, and legal papers. I opened it, placed it on the desk, and started making a list. Not of items to sell, but of ties to cut. I wasn't planning to argue. I wasn't planning to explain. I was planning to leave. And not out of spite, but because I finally understood I was no longer needed where I had given everything. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments in my head like film reels. Birthdays, hospital visits, rainy days on the veranda. I thought of Teresa's voice, of how she used to squeeze my hand under the table when the kids got loud. And I wondered what she would have done if she were still here. I think she would have told me, "Eduardo, don't stay where you're no longer loved. Go find peace." Kai. Next morning, I woke up before the sun. My bones ached the way they always did after a restless night, but this time it felt different. I wasn't tired. I was ready. I made myself a small breakfast, just toast with butter and cafe negro, and ate in the quiet of the kitchen. The birds hadn't started yet. It was the kind of silence that only happens before something changes. At exactly 8 a.m., I called Roberto, my old colleague from the architecture firm. He had transitioned into real estate years ago and still owed me a favor or two. When he picked up and heard my voice, he sounded surprised. "Eduardo, it's been years. Everything all right?" I hesitated. Then I said, "I need to sell my house. Quietly, fast, no questions." He was silent for a beat, then said, "Understood. I'll come by after lunch." I hung up and stared at the phone. It felt surreal, like I was orchestrating my own disappearance. But there was no panic in me, just clarity. After that, I called Lucia, my lawyer, another old friend, one of the few people who still treated me like a man, not a relic. She listened without interrupting. "You're serious?" she asked gently. I told her I was. Dead serious. She promised to handle the paperwork discreetly and efficiently. I walked through the house slowly, opening drawers, closets, touching things one last time. Teresa's scarves still hung behind the door, untouched since 2014. I folded them carefully, placing one in the suitcase. Just one. I didn't want to carry two. Much of the past, only what mattered. A photo album, my father's watch, a couple of notebooks filled with my old architectural sketches, and a paperback copy of Cien Años de Soledad, yellowed and broken at the spine. Around noon, Roberto arrived in his silver sedan, dressed in the same navy blazer he wore to every client meeting since 1999. He looked at me as if trying to gauge whether I'd gone senile. I handed him the keys, gave him a brief tour, and said, "Price it however you want. Just sell it. Don't tell anyone who it belongs to." He nodded slowly. "You're sure about this?" I said nothing, just pointed to the gate. I spent the rest of the afternoon with Lucia in her office, signing documents I had once sworn I'd never touch until death. Every signature felt like a nail, sealing a chapter. "You know they'll be shocked," she said, not looking up. "They'll survive," I replied. That night, I returned home to a house that no longer felt like mine. It already belonged to someone else in my mind, some young family with kids and noise and too many shoes at the door. I packed in silence. No music, no ceremony, just folding, stacking, sorting. I left the wedding album in its drawer, left the silverware Teresa loved, left my old suits. It was as if I was shedding a skin I no longer needed. Around midnight, I took one last walk around the house, touching the walls like I was saying goodbye to an old friend. I paused in the living room, sat in the armchair one final time, and whispered, "Thank you." I don't know to whom. Maybe to the walls. Maybe to her. Before going to bed, I wrote the note. Just a scrap of paper torn from an old notebook. "I'm gone. I hope you find happiness without my opinions." I placed it on the kitchen table, exactly where I used to set their plates on Sundays. Then I turned off the lights, walked upstairs, and slept deeper than I had in years. I woke up before dawn again, this time with an unusual lightness in my chest. Not joy, something quieter, like when you finally put down a heavy box you've been carrying for too long. I showered, dressed in my usual beige slacks and a clean white shirt, and tied the shoelaces of my worn leather shoes as if preparing for an ordinary day. But nothing about that day was ordinary. I rolled the suitcase down the staircase slowly, careful not to scratch the wood. The same wood I had installed myself in 1972. I paused at the door, looked around one last time. The smell of lemon floor wax and old books hung in the air. I didn't cry, I didn't even sigh. I just locked the door, slipped the keys into a small envelope, and slid them under Lucia's office door on the way out. I walked 2 blocks to the avenue, dragging the suitcase behind me. It made a faint clicking sound against the uneven sidewalk. The city was still waking up, shops closed, windows fogged, the scent of fresh bread from the corner panaderia. I didn't take a taxi. I wanted to feel each step, imprint it in my memory, like marking the path out of a place I would never return to. At the bus terminal, I bought a ticket to Mar del Plata. I had no plans to stay there forever, but it was far enough from Buenos Aires to breathe. Far enough that they wouldn't find me right away. I sat on a bench, suitcase between my knees, watching the other passengers fidget and scroll through their phones. No one looked at me, and for once, that was a relief. The bus ride lasted almost 6 hours. I didn't sleep. I watched the landscape change, from the congested streets of the capital to the open fields and low skies of the interior. I thought of nothing and everything at the same time. The rhythm of the tires on the road felt like a heartbeat slowing down. I wasn't running, I was releasing. When we arrived, I stepped off the bus and inhaled the ocean air like it was medicine. The scent of salt, the faint rot of seaweed, the cold wind off the Atlantic, it all hit me at once. I smiled for the first time in days, a real smile, not one made for someone else's comfort. I had no reservations, no hotel. I just walked with the suitcase, letting instinct guide my feet. I ended up in a small pension near the port, an old building painted blue and white, with lace curtains and a wrinkled man at the front desk who didn't ask questions. I paid in cash for a week, took the key, and went up to a modest room with a small window that overlooked the rooftops. I sat on the bed, stretched my legs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt anonymous and free. That night, I ate a sandwich de milanesa in a corner cafe where the waitress called everyone mi amor, and the TV played telenovelas with too much volume. I watched people live, arguing, laughing, spilling beer. No one knew who I was. No one expected anything from me. And strangely, that anonymity felt like home. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of gulls and distant waves crashing. It wasn't silence, but it was the kind of noise that doesn't demand anything from you. I opened the small window and let the cold sea air rush into the room. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be. No one esperando mi opinion, no table to set, no role to perform. Just me, the morning, and the sound of water against stone. I took a walk along the promenade. The sea was restless, grey and foaming, but it made me feel calm. There were old fishermen lining the edge, each wrapped in layers, smoking, silent. I nodded to one of them as I passed, and he nodded back. No, I had questions asked. That kind of unspoken recognition between men who've seen too much and say too little. It was more comforting than any word from my family in the last 5 years. I bought a small notebook at a libreria and a cheap pen. Back in the room, I began writing. Not a memoir, not a diary, just thoughts, fragments, observations, things I had never said aloud. I wrote about Teresa's hands, about the smell of her hair when she baked, about the way Marcos used to hold my finger with his whole hand when he was a boy. Writing made things solid again, made me feel like I still existed somewhere. I avoided calling anyone, not Lucia, not Roberto, certainly not my children. I wanted to see if they would notice, if they would reach out. Days passed. Nothing. No calls, no voicemails. No one had even tried to locate me through my bank or lawyer. I suppose when someone tells you not to give your opinion anymore, it's easier when they disappear. One afternoon, as I drank a cortado at a small cafe near the lighthouse, I overheard two women arguing about money. One of them reminded me of Teresa, sharp-tongued but fair. I chuckled without meaning to, and they both turned toward me. "¿Y usted qué piensa, abuelo?" one of them asked playfully. I paused, then smiled. I was told not to offer opinions anymore. They laughed, but not mockingly. The kind of laughter that says, "You're still part of the world." That night, I allowed myself to remember my last birthday. They brought a cake, with my name misspelled and sang too fast, eyes already on their phones. I had sat there, smiling with icing stuck to my teeth, thinking, is this love or maintenance? I had thought I was being dramatic. Now, from the distance of time and space, I realized I had been right to feel hollow. Love, when sincere, makes space for your voice, not silence. I started developing a routine: morning walks, afternoon readings, evening writing. The pension was quiet, and the staff left me alone. Once, the owner's daughter asked if I was a retired professor. I told her I used to build places for people to live, but forgot how to build space for myself. She didn't fully understand, but she smiled in that way young people do when they sense pain but choose kindness. The most surprising thing was how little I missed the noise. I didn't miss the clinking of forks at forced lunches, the empty birthday wishes, or even the house. What I missed when I missed anything at all, was Teresa. Her voice, her stillness, her ability to say everything just by placing her hand over mine. But strangely, in this new silence, I could almost hear her again. One morning, after nearly 2 weeks in Mar del Plata, I noticed a small sign posted outside a community center near the plaza. Clases de dibujo para adultos mayores, miércoles y viernes. Drawing classes for seniors. I hadn't drawn anything since I retired, at least not for pleasure. But something about the idea pulled me in. I noted the time and decided to show up. Not as an architect, not as Don Eduardo, just as a man with a pencil. The first class was held in a modest room with cracked windows and the faint smell of turpentine. There were 6 of us, all over 60, and a young woman named Florencia, who ran the class with infinite patience. She handed me a sketch pad and said, "No rules, just draw what you feel." I stared at the blank page for several minutes before my hand began to move. At first, just lines, then rooftops, then shadows that reminded me of my house in Palermo. After class, Florencia asked me if I'd drawn before. I told her about my years as an architect, and she lit up. "Ah, so you already know how to see." That phrase stayed with me. Not draw, but see. Maybe that's what I had stopped doing, seeing things for what they really were, including myself. That afternoon I drew Teresa's hands from memory. It wasn't perfect, but it felt honest. Little by little, people began to recognize me, not by name, but by presence. The old man who walks by the pier at dawn, the one who brings a thermos of mate and shares it with the pigeons. A boy who skated past me one day yelled, "Hola, arquitecto," and I almost laughed out loud. I never told anyone my name, but I suppose my hands still gave me away. They remember what they've built. One of the women in the drawing class, Elvira, invited me to her grandson's birthday at a parrilla near the beach. I hesitated, but went. The food was loud, the music louder, and the family messier than I was used to. But they laughed with their mouths open, and no one checked their phones during the meal. I felt awkward at first, then strangely comfortable. Elvira handed me a plate and said, "No one's too old to be included." That simple line nearly undid me. The days began to blur into a rhythm I hadn't expected. I stopped checking the calendar. I didn't wait for Sundays anymore. That day had lost its meaning to me. It was no longer a ritual of disappointment. I found myself more connected to Tuesdays and Fridays now, drawing days when I could create something without anyone interrupting me halfway through with, "We know what we're doing." I still hadn't contacted Marcos or Sofia. Part of me wondered if they had finally realized what they'd lost, if they had sat at that empty dining table and noticed the absence like a missing limb. But another part of me suspected they hadn't, that they were relieved, that silence, once requested, had become convenient. I wasn't angry, just sad, in a distant, muted kind of way, like watching an old movie with the volume turned down. And then one morning, I received a letter at the pension. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Sophia's cursive, tidy and slanted just like her mother's. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was short, only 5 sentences. "Papa, we went to your house. It was empty. I don't understand. Are you okay? Please call me. We didn't mean to hurt you." I folded it slowly, placed it in my notebook, and sat for a long time in silence. I must have read Sophia's letter 10 times that morning. Each word felt carefully chosen, but also late. There was no anger in her message, no accusations, just confusion, worry, a faint trace of regret. But what struck me most was what it didn't say. There was no mention of that Sunday, no acknowledgement of the words that shattered everything. "Don't offer any more opinions." That omission told me more than any apology could. I considered writing back. I even drafted a reply in my notebook, something gentle, something clear. But when I read it over, it sounded like I was trying to comfort them, like I was trying to justify my absence so they wouldn't feel guilty. And I didn't want to do that. Not anymore. I didn't vanish to punish them, but neither was I going to soothe their conscience while mine was still healing. Instead, I took a blank page and wrote just one sentence. I am alive, I am safe, and I am finally at peace. No return address, no phone number, just that. I mailed it from a small kiosk near the pier, paying cash, watching as the envelope slipped into the slot. It felt final, but not cruel. I wasn't closing a door. I was simply walking through one. That evening, as I watched the sun dip into the ocean, I realized I no longer carried that ache in my chest. The one that had been there every Sunday for years. The ache of not being seen, not being heard. I had become visible. Again, not to my children, but to myself. And that, I've learned, is the kind of visibility that matters most when you're 80 years old. Over the following days, I found myself sketching new things, less from memory, more from the present. A fisherman's hands, a row of boats, the way the sea curves into the horizon like an open question. I wasn't designing houses anymore. I was just capturing what existed around me. Things I would have never noticed back in Buenos Aires, where I was too busy trying. To stay relevant in a house that no longer wanted me, Elvira gave me a plant for my windowsill. Para que no te olvides de cuidar algo, she said with a wink. A little jade plant in a chipped ceramic pot. Every morning I'd water it, rotate it to face the sun and sit beside it with my notebook. It became part of my ritual, a small thing. But life, I've learned, is made of small things that no one can take from you. One afternoon, I saw a young couple arguing on the boardwalk. The man waved his hands dismissively. The woman looked away, crushed, and I thought to myself, that's how it starts, the erosion. Not all betrayals are loud. Some begin with the simplest gestures, an eye roll, a hand wave, a silencing. I almost wanted to tell them, to warn them, but I stayed quiet, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for their own learning. And it dawned on me, maybe disappearing wasn't about leaving others behind. Maybe it was about finally walking toward myself, not the man I had been, molded into by fatherhood, marriage, expectation. But the man I had forgotten I was before all of that. Eduardo, architect, dreamer, quiet observer of light and shadow. A man who still had things to say, even if no one asked. There was something liberating about no longer being Papa or Don Eduardo to anyone in particular. I became just the gentleman with the notebook, el señor que dibuja en silencio. And I loved it. I loved that no one expected me to fix their lives or to entertain them or to listen patiently while they ignored me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't performing any role, I was simply existing. I began frequenting a used bookshop a few blocks from the pension. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Claudio, had a habit of leaving handwritten notes tucked inside the books, quotes, reflections, sometimes even jokes. We'd talk for hours about Borges, Cortázar, Sabato. He never asked about my past. I never offered it. But in those conversations, I felt intellectually alive again, as if my mind had been asleep and someone finally opened a window. One rainy afternoon, I helped Claudio move boxes in the back of the shop. As we lifted a stack of dusty encyclopedias, he looked at me and said, "¿Sabe qué, Don? Usted parece un hombre que un día decidió empezar de nuevo." I didn't reply, but I smiled, because that's exactly what I was. A man who stopped asking for a seat at the table and decided to build a new one in the middle of nowhere with his own two hands. I started noticing small things I had once overlooked, the way elderly couples held hands while walking slowly, the warmth of a café con leche on a cold day, the sound of children kicking a ball in the alley behind the pension. All these things were always there. I had just been too buried in disappointment to see them. Now, they were my anchors, my reminders that life continues, even when the familiar has collapsed. Sometimes I'd wonder about Teresa, not in the grief-stricken way. I used to, but with a kind of silent companionship. I'd imagine what she'd say if she saw me sketching by the sea or talking with Claudio about poetry. I think she'd be proud. I think she'd say, "This is who you were before we became everything to each other. And that man deserves to live too." I hadn't worn a watch in weeks. Time, once so rigid, had softened. My days were no longer measured in hours, but in moments. How many pages I wrote, how many new faces I saw, how many times I laughed. Unexpectedly. I had no plans, no schedule, just breath and space and a view of the ocean from a room with creaky floors and chipped paint. One evening, as I was locking up the community center after helping Elvira with some event, she turned to me and said, "You know, Eduardo, you're not a ghost. That's what you think you are, isn't it? A man who left everything behind to disappear. But ghosts haunt. You don't. You live." I didn't answer right away, but her words stayed with me long after I went to bed. Maybe I had been a ghost in Buenos Aires, not the kind that rattles chains, but the kind that's talked over, walked around, politely ignored. Here, in this new place, I had become visible again, not because I demanded attention, but because I stopped apologizing for existing. About a month after I received Sophia's letter, I saw a family sitting at a cafe across the street from mine. A man who looked like Marcos, same stiff posture, same way of cutting his food too precisely. His wife was talking, the children glued to their phones. I watched him for a long time, wondering if Marcos ever watched himself in a mirror. If he ever noticed the way he had turned into someone his children might someday want to escape from. I thought about going back more than once, not out of longing but curiosity. What would they say if I knocked on the door? If I sat at that familiar table again, unannounced, and said, "Well, I'm here. Do you still not want my opinions?" But the thought never lasted, because I didn't want to return to being tolerated. I had tasted the dignity of solitude, and I wasn't willing to trade it for proximity ever again. One morning, as I was sketching the harbor from a bench, a young girl came up to me. She couldn't have been older than 8. She watched me draw in silence, then asked, "Puedo ver?" I showed her the page and she smiled. "Es bonito." I thanked her and she ran off. That simple interaction warmed something inside me. It reminded me that the world still had room for softness, for spontaneous kindness, for people who asked to see, not to judge. At the pension, the old man at the front desk started calling me Don Eduardo with a small bow. It made me laugh the first time. "I thought I had retired that title," I said. He shrugged. "No se puede dejar de ser quien uno es." Maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't changed who I was, just where I was finally allowed to be him. I wrote Sophia another note, short, like the first. "Thank you for writing. I am well. I hope you are too." I didn't say more. I didn't ask questions. I didn't open doors I wasn't ready to walk through. Sometimes healing means choosing not to return to the source of the wound, even when the wound has closed. In the community center, Florencia started organizing an exhibition of our class's drawings. She asked if I wanted to include mine. My first instinct was to decline. But then I thought of Teresa, of how proud she used to be of my work, even when it was just a crooked shelf or a garden plan. I chose 3 drawings, the rooftops of the city, the sea in the early morning, and the outline of a woman's hands. Florencia didn't ask whose hands. She simply said, "They're beautiful." On the night of the exhibition, the little room filled with neighbors, laughter, the smell of cheap wine and empanadas. I stood in the back watching people look at my sketches. Not with awe, not with analysis, just with interest. A woman pointed at the drawing of the rooftops and said, "It feels like something you dream, not something you see." I took that as the highest compliment. Later that evening, Florencia clinked a glass and said a few words. She thanked everyone for sharing their art, for being brave enough to let themselves be seen. And in that moment I realized I had not disappeared. I had simply stopped yelling into a void. And somehow, in the quiet, I had finally been heard. A few days after the exhibition, Claudio offered me a part-time job at the bookshop. Just a few hours in the afternoon, he said. I need someone who knows how to handle books like living things. I chuckled, but I accepted. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to feel useful again, like a man who still had something to give. And in that quiet, dusty space, surrounded by words and stories, I felt more myself than I had in years. It became a new rhythm. Mornings by the sea, afternoons at the shop, evenings with my notebook. Sometimes customers would ask me for recommendations, and I loved that they assumed I knew what I was talking about. One woman came back 3 times to thank me for introducing her to Saramago. I didn't correct her when she called me Professor. Maybe, in a way, I was one again. Elvira invited me to a Sunday lunch at her home. I hesitated. Sundays were still fragile territory in my heart. But I went. Her family was loud and chaotic, the kind that passes food across the table without asking and talks over each other with love, not disregard. At one point, her grandson spilled soda on the floor, and instead of getting scolded, everyone laughed. I found myself laughing too, without guilt. After lunch, Elvira poured me a small glass of liqueur and said, "You've changed, Eduardo." I looked at her, surprised. "How so?" She smiled. "You don't flinch when someone interrupts you anymore. You don't shrink. You speak slower, like you know your words have weight again." I didn't answer, but I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot coming undone after years of tension. That night, walking home alone, I passed a phone booth, the kind that barely exist anymore. For a second, I imagined dialing Marcos or Sophia, hearing their voices, saying something like, "I'm all right. I forgive you." But I didn't. Not because I hadn't forgiven them, but because I had forgiven myself first. And that made the rest less urgent. I started sleeping better, dreaming again. Sometimes the dreams were strange. Teresa walking through, markets we'd never visited, or me sketching blueprints with invisible ink. But I welcomed them. They were signs that my mind had stopped replaying the past like a broken record. I was finally making room for new stories. At the bookshop, Claudio and I began reorganizing the entire poetry section. It was tedious work, alphabetizing authors, cross-referencing editions, arguing about where Neruda belonged. But it felt good. My hands ached, but they were useful aches. They reminded me I was still capable, still present, still part of something. One afternoon, a tourist from Buenos Aires came into the shop. He was looking for a gift for his father. He's a retired architect, set in his ways, kind of stubborn. I smiled gently, led him to a shelf, and handed him a copy of La Arquitectura del Silencio, a lesser-known book I'd always admired. "This one," I said. "It's about finding space in unexpected places." He thanked me. I never told him my name. One morning, I found a small envelope, slipped under the door of the pension. No return address again. Inside, a short letter, this time from Marcos, handwritten unlike him. "Papa, we went back to the house again, everything gone. I keep thinking about that Sunday, about my words. I was careless. I see that now. I hope wherever you are, you're okay. I miss you. Marcos." I read it twice, then folded it and placed it with Sophia's letter. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. Just tired. Their words were reaching me, but in a different language now. A language of delay, of recognition that comes only after silence makes space for truth. I didn't feel the urge to respond, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer needed to explain my absence. Sometimes, silence is the most honest sentence you can offer someone who once silenced you. Claudio noticed I was quieter that day at the shop. "Todo bien, Don?" he asked gently. I nodded, then handed him a book to shelve. I didn't feel like explaining. He didn't insist. That's what I appreciated most in this new life. People let me be. They didn't interpret my pauses as flaws. They didn't rush to fill my silences with noise. At the next drawing class, Florencia asked us to draw a place that felt like home. Some drew kitchens, others their childhood streets. I drew the bench by the sea where I watched the sun rise each morning. The waves, the railing, even the chipped wood under my feet. I labeled it simply, Lugar donde respiro. When I held it up, everyone nodded. No one asked why. They felt it. Elvira, sitting beside me, whispered, "It's beautiful." Then, almost without looking at me, she added, "You think they'll ever come find you?" I thought for a second, then said, "Maybe, but I'm not hiding. I'm just elsewhere." She smiled in that knowing way only older people can smile, the kind that carries both grief and peace in the same breath. Some nights, I still dream of my house, not in ruins but hollow, like a museum after closing hours. I walk through the rooms, but nothing speaks to me anymore. Not the books, not the paintings, not even Teresa's scarf hanging behind the door. In the dream, I leave through the back garden and never look back. When I wake up, I always find myself smiling, because some dreams are just truths wearing costumes. One Friday afternoon, as I was closing up the bookshop, a teenager walked in just before I turned the key. He was breathless, carrying a sketchbook. "My abuelo told me you draw," he said. "Can you help me?" I almost laughed at the irony. Me, the man told not to give opinions, being asked by a stranger for guidance. I said yes. We sat at the counter, opened his notebook, and began. His drawings were raw, emotional. Buildings that leaned like they carried burdens. People with no faces. "They say I should study engineering," he said, "but I want to draw." I looked at him and said, "Then draw, even if no one listens, especially then." He smiled like I had handed him permission. And in that moment I realized my voice hadn't been taken. It had just been waiting for the right ears. That evening, after the boy left, I sat at the counter in the bookshop long after closing time. The lights were dim, the street outside quiet. I thought about how strange life is, that sometimes to be heard, you first need to go completely silent, to vanish, not in death, but in presence. And when you reappear, it's not in the same form. You return transformed, not louder, but clearer. Later, walking back to the pension, I passed a group of teenagers skateboarding near the boardwalk. One of them waved at me. "Hey, Don Arquitecto," I waved back. They had no idea who I was, not really, but they gave me a name, a place, recognition. I never thought I'd find a version of myself in a coastal town full of strangers, but here I was, claimed not by blood, but by encounters. Claudio began trusting me to open the shop some mornings. I liked the quiet before the doors opened, the smell of old pages, the soft hum of the fridge in the back. One morning, I organized a small display near the entrance, books about solitude, aging, rediscovery. I called it Segundas Mitades. People lingered there longer than usual. Some even asked me what I recommended, and I told them stories, not mine, but the ones that helped me breathe again. Elvira and I began sharing lunch every Wednesday, nothing formal. Sometimes just empanadas from the bakery and soda in plastic cups. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about music, about dreams, about nothing. It was companionship without demand. And that kind of companionship is rare, especially at our age. No one asks, "What are we?" They just sit beside you and stay. One rainy afternoon, I received another letter, this time from Tomas, my grandson. The one I tried to warn, the one who once looked through me like I was glass. His handwriting was messy, rushed. "Abuelo, I messed up. The startup failed. I didn't listen. I should have. I know you were trying to help. I think about you all the time. I hope you're okay. I'm sorry." I held the letter like it was made of glass, fragile, honest. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated, but I didn't. I felt something softer, like watching a young tree bend in the wind and realizing it might survive after all. I wrote him back, this time more than a line. "Tomas, Failure is not the end. Listening takes courage. I'm proud of you for writing. Take care of your mother. I mailed it the next morning. My hand steady, my heart calm. That same day, while sketching at the pier, I overheard a couple talking about their plans for retirement. "We'll probably move closer to the kids," the man said. The woman sighed. "Or maybe somewhere where we can finally breathe." That stuck with me, the assumption that proximity equals connection. I used to think that too. Now I know better. Distance, when chosen with love, can be the most dignified form of self-preservation. When I returned to the pension that evening, the owner handed me a small package. "Un regalo, parece." I opened it upstairs. Inside was a leather-bound notebook embossed with my initials. No note, no sender, just a quiet gesture from someone who had seen me, truly seen me. I ran my fingers over the cover, sat down at the desk, and wrote one word on the first page: begin. 2 weeks later, I was walking back from the library when I saw them, Sophia and Marcos, standing outside the pension, suitcases beside them, looking lost. Marcos kept glancing at his phone, while Sophia held a folded piece of paper, my last note, I assumed. For a moment I froze. I had imagined this scene 100 different ways. None of them felt like this. So quiet, so real. They didn't see me at first. I stood across the street, behind the trunk of a tree, heart steady, not racing. I didn't feel fear or anger. I felt choice, that rare and sacred power to decide. I stepped forward, slow, measured. When Sophia finally looked up and saw me, she gasped. Marcos followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. We stood like that for a few seconds, 3 points in time converging. "I didn't think you'd actually come," I said. My voice didn't shake. Sophia stepped forward. "We didn't know how else to reach you." Marcos remained still. It wasn't hostility, it was shame, heavy, honest shame. "May we talk?" Sophia asked. I nodded. "Let's walk." I led them toward the pier, the same one I had walked alone so many times before. Today I wasn't alone, but I wasn't broken either. We didn't talk much at first. The sound of the ocean filled the spaces between us. Finally, Sophia said, "I'm sorry, Papa. We treated you like an obligation, like your silence was more comfortable than your presence." I said nothing, not because I disagreed, but because I had waited too long to interrupt that kind of clarity. Let her speak. Let it all come. Marcos eventually found his voice. That day, at lunch, I was arrogant. I thought I knew everything. I didn't. I don't. I missed you, even before you left. I just didn't know how to say it. I nodded. "I know." He looked relieved, and more than that, humbled. Not the son I remembered, but a man who had felt lost deeply enough to grow. We sat on a bench facing the sea. I didn't promise them anything. I didn't say, "Let's go back to how it was," because we couldn't, and maybe we shouldn't. But I told them calmly, "I'm not angry. I found something here that I didn't know I needed. Myself, my peace. If we are to continue, it has to be from here, from who I am now." They both nodded. Sophia had tears in her eyes but didn't cry. Marcos just whispered, "Understood." I didn't invite them to stay, but I didn't send them away either. I told them about the bookshop, the drawing classes, the plant Elvira gave me. I spoke like someone who had nothing to prove. They listened like people who finally understood that presence is earned, not demanded. That love must make space, not just fill silence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up and said, "I'll walk you to the station." Marcos shook his head. "No, we'll stay the night and head back tomorrow." I nodded once. No hugs, no tears, just quiet understanding. At the door of the pension, I paused and looked at them. "I'm glad you came," I said, and I meant it. But I was also glad they would leave. The next morning, they were gone before I woke up. I found a note tucked under my door. "Thank you for seeing us. We'll respect your space. Love." Sophia, that was enough. Not everything needed to be rebuilt. Some things, if they were ever to grow again, needed to be planted elsewhere. with different soil and slower hands. I sat with my coffee by the window and watched the early light stretch across the rooftops. There was no emotional hangover, just stillness. What I had feared might reopen old wounds had, in fact, confirmed something deeper. I no longer lived in the space where those wounds were inflicted. I had moved inward, upward, or forward. That day at the bookshop, Claudio noticed my mood. "You look like a man who's finally dropped a heavy backpack." I smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe I just stopped walking uphill." He laughed, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Either way, you're standing straighter." It was true. My spine didn't bend like it used to, not from age, but from burden. That Friday at drawing class, Florencia asked me to teach the warm-up session. "Just a short exercise," she said. I hesitated, then agreed. I stood before the small group of gray-haired rebels and told them to close their eyes. "Now draw what you feel, not what you see, even if it's messy, especially if it's messy." They laughed, but they drew, and I watched them come alive. After class, Elvira took my arm as we walked. "You're teaching again," she said softly. "You're giving again." I shook my head. "I'm just sharing space." She stopped. "That's what giving is, Eduardo. Making space for others without disappearing yourself." I didn't reply, but I held her arm tighter, not because I was afraid of falling, but because I wanted to stay connected. One evening, I sat at the pier with my notebook open to the first page, the one that only said, "Begin." I added a second word beneath it, "Again." Then I flipped the page and started sketching the pension, the bookshop, the pier, the faces I had come to know. It wasn't a farewell. It was documentation, a way of saying, I lived here, I mattered here. That night, I dreamed of Teresa. Again, she was standing in the doorway of our old house, smiling, but this time she didn't ask me to stay. She just nodded proud and turned toward the sea. I followed her gaze and woke up with tears in my eyes, not from grief, but from gratitude. Love doesn't always ask us to return. Sometimes it blesses our departure, and I knew then, as clearly as I had known anything in my life, I hadn't disappeared. I had arrived, not where I once belonged, but where I had chosen to be. And that choice, made in silence, became the loudest thing I had ever said. A few weeks later, I received a small envelope in the mail. Inside, a photo of Tomas standing in front of what looked like a classroom. On the back, in his handwriting, "Started teaching drawing to kids at the community center. I tell them about you sometimes. Hope that's okay." I held the photo against my chest, eyes closed. It was more than okay. It was healing passed forward. Life in Mar del Plata didn't change much after that. I still walked the same paths, opened the bookshop each afternoon, drank my cortado by the sea. But something had shifted inside me, not dramatically, quietly, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. The space felt more mine. The silence no longer echoed with loss. It resonated with presence. I didn't expect more letters, and none came. I didn't need them. I had let go of waiting, let go of needing things to be different, to be at peace. My children had their lives. I had mine. And in the soft rhythm of this new existence, we could coexist, separate but not estranged, connected by something deeper than proximity, acceptance. The jade plant on my windowsill bloomed one morning, tiny white flowers I had never seen before. I took it as a sign, not from above, not mystical, just a reminder that even the quietest lives bear fruit. Even things left in corners, watered with small acts, find a way to grow. I touched one of the blossoms gently and whispered, "Gracias." That weekend, Claudio asked if I'd consider co-hosting a reading night at the shop. "You don't have to read," he said. "Just be there. Your presence. It keeps people grounded." I agreed, not because I needed the attention, but because I understood now. Presence is not about being seen. It's about choosing to stay where you're valued. On the night of the event, the room filled with voices, soft laughter, and poems read aloud. Someone asked me what I thought about a particular stanza, and I smiled before answering. "You know," I said, "I used to be told not to offer opinions. Now I just share what I feel. People can take it or leave it, but I no longer silence myself." When I walked home that night, the air was crisp, the stars clearer than usual. I paused outside the pension, looking up at the light in my window. It struck me that without fanfare or announcement, I had built a new home, not with bricks or design, but with patience, boundaries, and quiet conviction. The kind of structure that doesn't collapse when others stop clapping. So here I am, not waiting for applause, not bitter, just a man who was told to stop speaking and chose to begin living. I didn't disappear. I reclaimed myself. And if someone, someday, sits at a table and remembers me with warmth, I hope they'll understand. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that walks away and rebuilds in silence something unbreakable. Sometimes all we need is a place where our voice isn't a burden, where silence doesn't mean exclusion, and simply being present doesn't have to be justified. Don Eduardo's story might not be so different from yours or someone you know, someone who one day stopped begging for space and finally began to truly exist. If you've ever felt this way, left aside, ignored in your own home, small among those who should have held you close, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes, opening up is the first step to no longer carrying it alone. And if this story touched you in some way, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. We never know how loud a quiet gesture can be inside someone's heart. If you want to hear more real stories from ordinary people who found strength in their own steps, stay with us. There's so much more to tell, with respect, truth, and room to feel. Room.